Kansas. The best way to study the ocean is far away from it, because it's going to kill you. And so you better get on a bus now, and I'll explain why. But basically, the rate of asthma is increasing worldwide, and it's increasing because of red tides. And basically, this is the bottom line of the talk. And there's 100 million asthmatics every year, of which 50% of their asthma attacks are generated by red tides within 25 to 250 kilometers of the coasts. Next slide. And as little as how much air you breathe every day. It's about 20,000 liters. That's not beer, that's air. And it turns out that you're breathing in the bottom of your lung, the alveolar tissue, is about 100 microns wide. And Saharan dust is 1 to 2 microns, and the aerosols of red tides is about 1 to 25 microns. And they are an organic particle, or a dissolved organic particle that's been turned into an aerosol at the end of the red tides, and that's how red tides end. And we knew about 25 or 30 years ago, but of course nobody reads the literature, that if you basically dissolved organic carbons acts as a carrier for halides. That's how sea salts get out of the ocean quickly. And Bob Deuce, a number of years ago, some of the renegades from the faculty from University of Rhode Island know Bob, and pointed out, he did a study where the iodine increased 20 to 30 fold if you, basically in the particles that are leaving the water if you threw a little diatom poop on top of it. And basically it acts as a carrier. And this becomes important because if you're near a nuclear waste reprocessing plant, it's putting out iodine 129, and it's only got a half-life around 16 million years, which is not really a problem for any of you in the room. And the other interesting, okay, next slide. And so the question is, what does this got to do with asthma? Well, oceanographers don't do anything useful, and the water doesn't move for MDs. Okay, so they made all these studies of where they ran around the world and asked how many kids had asthma. And the only ones that ever asked how far we were from the ocean was the Italians. Nobody else worried about the ocean. Okay. And it turns out that these red dots are where Karenia, that's Karenia brevis. Karen Steidiger is a precocious young lady, and when she was in grammar school, she started studying phytoplankton, and in 1965 started a series of cell counts for the West Florida shelf. And in the process, she also counted copepod and ciliates. So I'll be using this data a little bit later, but the name Karenia is after Karen. And she's also the person who the Steidiger Auditorium is named after. And all these red dots are where Karenia has formed blooms and the coastal asthma is greater than 9%. And the green dots and open circles are where an even nastier creature, Ostreopsis, is another dinoflagellate. It hangs out on coral reefs. And it's actually more toxic than the brevetoxins. Next slide. And the question is, well, why are all these red tides occurring, and why is the rate of asthma increasing? And it's got to do with oil spills and nuclear waste recycling plants and pesticides, and you name it, anything we do, we mess up the ocean. And in the process, we kill copepods. And in the process of killing copepods, you're no longer grazing phytoplankton, including the HABs. And so the HABs take off. And this is an example. This is a lovely time series from Plymouth. It's an example where the medical people and the oceanographers didn't ever talk to each other. And This is a weekly time series every week for 30 to 60 years of the zooplankton off Plymouth. And the red lines are two oil spills in 67 and 78. And basically what happened is the oil killed the copepods. The copepods were no longer there to graze the phytoplankton, and so up comes harmful algal blooms. And the next slide. And this is the same slide as before. This is a nice one to show in, thank you. And this is the frequency of asthma on the, as I said, it's in the Isle of Wight, which is designed to study cohorts of asthmatic children. And so what they're sitting is in a pool of red tide organisms. So every year they get reinfected. And nobody in Plymouth figured it out, told them. But in fact, the exponential rate of asthma, these plots are for the Isle of Wight, Bay of Biscay, Norway, and Ireland, and their increase of prevalence of asthma among school children. And basically, what happens is, at the end of a red tide anywhere in the world of Karenia, the bacteria lyse the phytoplankton. So you go from a particular type of brevetoxin to dissolved, and then it becomes aerosolized. And then when it's aerosolized, the sea breezes bring it ashore, along with a radiohalide trigger, a tracer rather, iodine-129. The next slide. And these are the beasties from Karenia micromoitoi, which was off England, to Brevis here, to this guy Ostreopsis, and it's 10 to 100-fold more poisonous than Karenia. And they don't go on an Italian cruise line. They don't know how to drive their boats. And two of them ran into two other boats in 1981, the different, same day, different accidents off Genoa and Livorno. And a year later, 100 people had to leave the beaches in Genoa. Because what happened is that spilled the oil, it killed the copepods, and then when it killed the copepods, up came this Ostreopsis. Basically, it's a kind of dinoflagellate that likes to sit on the bottom on coral reefs, but if you upset its habitat, it'll go into the water column. And so it drove 100 people in one day, breathing problems to a hospital in Genoa. A couple of years before, the same thing had happened off India. So it's very toxic, and it's one of the more powerful toxins in the world. Next slide. And this is again a few more oil spills thrown in, and again you see the increasing asthma, and every time there's an oil spill, it kills copepods, it releases grazing pressure on phytoplankton. But that's not the worst part of the story. Next one. In addition to overfishing oil spills, this is 50 years ago, a certain lady wrote a book called Silent Spring, and basically at the time she was complaining about radionuclides. But in fact it's gotten worse, and what this is the increase in frequency of asthma next to coral reef countries. For like Palau, Tahiti, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Hawaii. And basically there, you've destroyed the original bottom substrate for Ostreopsis. You put it in the water column, and then you've wiped out the herbivores. And so this is the increase in prevalence. And that, in each case, those red lines are when the warming exceeded 29 degrees. It really did, Bob. In fact, you get up to 30 in some places. And it's because it's not, in the shallow pools and the water's not moving very much, and so it jumps up. Next slide. And so what we'd like to do eventually is predict when people should head for the hills. Because basically, this is an example of what's already is being done at Goddard. For dust is the red calculation. Blue is cyclone storms, which induce sea spray, which is goes with sea spray and It's the same thing as Hab poisons. They travel together. And smoke in this case. And you can see the real wide distribution of the dust. And basically, people die from asthma because they don't have access to drugs. And this is particularly true in undeveloped countries. Next slide. And the problem is also true for thyroid cancer. This is the West Indian shelf, and it's the closest isomorph of the West Florida shelf. And they kindly surveyed the prevalence of thyroid cancer in India. And it's all in the coastal areas. And these are the high areas of thyroid cancer in both children and adults. And it's also where they have very high rates of asthma. In fact, they co-occur. And so what the radioiodine is doing is it's acting as, it's a halide, so it's traveling with the DOC, which is the poison. And you're seeing very high concentrations in a state called Kerala. It's like, here it's Florida, it's the tourist capital of India. So I'm sure I'll be banned from there soon when we publish this one. But it's not a good place to visit. Next slide. Or live, for that matter. It's a little like Florida, actually. And so okay, that's sort of hand waving, and the question is, can you prove any of this? And if some of you may remember a thing called the scientific method, and you're supposed to have a quantitative hypothesis. And the more, so that's what I try to do. And I build biological models and then blame Bob when they don't work. Because invariably it's the flow fields that move the biology around. And she keeps telling me that. And so what I'm going to show you is some of the results. Because what we're saying is oil, pesticides, radio waste, anything that kills copepods will increase HABs. And increased HABs means increased asthma triggers as long as it's blown ashore. And so what this is a good old Deepwater Horizon site, and this is 3 examples of time series. That's why I was talking about Karen. One is from 1965, one is from 2001, and one is from 2010, 2011. So that we're able to say, at least for the West Florida shelf, with this historical data, did the oil spills make a difference? Next slide. And so you want to separate out the difference between overfishing and oil spills. And this is an example of a time series in the summer of zooplankton abundances over the last 50, 60 years. And you'll note that the zooplankton dived before the Ishtok oil spill. Too bad, you can't blame oil people. And it stayed low in front of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Then you say, well, okay, but there's not very many data points. And I've been quoted a number of times saying the data doesn't matter. And with the next slide. So we switched to something else. The British had their weekly time series of zooplankton. Well, we have our weekly time series of phytoplankton. What these are, the cell counts that Karen initiated along with some federal agencies back in the 50s. And what we're going to do is compare these times. These are the weekly mean on the 5-meter isobaph between Cedar Key and Naples. And it's an example of how much phytoplankton arrived at the beach. And it should tell you something about the asthma triggers as well. The next slide. And this is the lovely slide prepared by the Florida Department of Health, which they don't show to too many people, evidently. And it shows the increase in respiratory diseases and asthma mortalities in the state of Florida. And of course, it's increased over the last few decades. Nobody knows why, of course. And nobody wants to discuss this because we want to keep the tourists away. And there's one set of data that also shows the thyroid rate cancer in Florida, and it increased as well. And you can say, well, there's no waste reprocessing plants in the Gulf of Mexico. That's true, but iodine-129 doesn't travel in the water. In fact, you can use it when it's released, say in England and in France, because they have a lot of waste to reprocess in nuclear because of their nuclear power plants. You can actually trace that water up into the Arctic, down across the Atlantic, down past New York. And in this case, it also shows up in the air as well. And it turns out that I used to work for the Department of Energy at one point, and they faced things they didn't tell me about. And it turns out that the Savannah River Lab, which did all the reprocessing for nuclear waste in World War II, had one of the highest rates of iodine-129 in the world in the Savannah River. And it turns out that so basically the iodine-129 comes down the Savannah River and runs in a carenia that's sitting there as well, so it becomes aerosolized. And when you read the literature, the childhood rate of asthma cancer in Charleston is enormously high. And it turns out that the asthma rate is very high, and they're both coming from the same trigger. Next slide. So what we tried to do was, okay, since the West Florida Shelf is an isomorph of these other areas, that means the same type of ecosystem. And if we match the data and it's quantitative, what can we say about the oil spill? And the bottom line is that we'd already messed up the West Florida Shelf before we started spilling any oil on it. And then in fact, the perturbation due to the oil was only about 10% of what it was due to overfishing. So it already had been messed up. Next slide. And so what we did was we matched, can we go back one slide? This is Karen's data and the FWI data for 1965, 66, 01, 02, and 10, 11. And you can see the model's doing fairly well, like it's fantastic. The observations of the circles and the black line is the calculations for and these are the daily calculations over a 2-year period for each of the 3 time periods. And what it's telling you is that, well, if you can get part of the model right, you must have something right, because you fudged all the numbers to get it, but it doesn't match anything else. And the next slide. And yep, turns out it matches the zooplankton as well. And Temera is, there is no herbivore, it turns out. The bloody copepods eat anything, it doesn't make a difference. But it's whether they eat a lot of phytoplankton or a little phytoplankton to qualify. And Temera eats a lot of phytoplankton, so it's called a herbivore. And the important point is that there's 10-fold less Temera on the shelf now than it was earlier. And it turns out that they also went into reproductive failure. There wasn't as many of the early life stages of the copepod. Even this is now off Florida, Tampa Bay. Okay, so while there's arguments about how much oil made it to shore, the oil did get into Mobile Bay in Alabama, and the water does move from Alabama to here along the coast. At least some people say that anyway. And so the 10-fold decline in the zooplankton was because of some perturbation, shall we say. And it led to a very large increase in the red tides. And this is a worldwide phenomenon. It's not just in the West Florida Shelf. Next slide. And we matched, even got a few bacteria. And because there wasn't many bacterial data, but and by the way, we don't throw away data. I mean, if that's all there is, okay? Next slide. And the same is true for appendicularians, Lycoplura, and even ciliates. You can even match those little deers. Next slide. So, we're ready to move on, because the plankton model's working, and Bob must have fudged this somehow, because this is, that's too good, Bob. Just can't.
Well, we're going to try it again.
But that's utterly fantastic, okay? Of course, now, they are Bob satellite track drifters, so maybe, who knows? Maybe he fudges them. And it's Bob's model as well. But nevertheless, given such a wonderful, that circulation model is working, and since biology, the difference between biological oceanography and marine biology is if you can wade to it, it's marine biology. And if it's over your head, it's biological oceanography, and you need to talk to Bob or one of his friends. So that we now going to start modeling liable fish survival, some oil spills on the other side of the Gulf, and from my point of view, more importantly, the global health, public health consequences, because if you could actually tell people when to leave the beach, or at least to stockpile medicines, then you'd be much better off. And as I say, both Karenia and it's a worldwide problem. And it's within 25 to 100 kilometers to the beach. Oh, what I did say was, you're not safe in the hills either. During the Indian monsoon, the red tide and those thyroid cancers, they get up into the mountains because the winds are so strong. And it's also true of in the case of the African monsoon, it's really interesting because during one time a year, the winds come out of the Sahara and they put in iron and they grow trichodesmium, and then the winds reverse. So after you've grown trichodesmium and Karenia, then the winds bring the aerosol back on, and you can actually see it in the different type of cancer and pneumonia rates. So that unfortunately aerosols are very important, and maybe Kansas is okay.